June 18, 1815, 11:30 a.m. Waterloo, Belgium. The mud was knee-deep, and so were Napoleon's chances. The morning began not with thunder, but with silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the chests of 140,000 men spread across the rolling farmland of Belgium. They had slept, or tried to, in rain-soaked fields, their uniforms clinging to skin, their boots filled with water that would never dry. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others sharpened bayonets that would taste blood before sunset. And a few simply stared at the sky, wondering if God was watching. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, his hands clasped behind his back, his bicorn hat casting a shadow over eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. He was 45 years old. He had conquered Europe. He had crowned himself emperor. He had rewritten the rules of war itself. And now he was here, in a Belgian field, facing an alliance that wanted him dead or caged. Behind him, the Grande Armée stirred. 72,000 soldiers, veterans of 100 battles, men who had marched from Madrid to Moscow, who had bled in Egypt and frozen in Russia. They believed in him, not because he was kind, not because he was merciful, but because he won. Across the valley on another ridge, the Duke of Wellington watched through a telescope. Arthur Wellesley, the Iron Duke, 56 years old, stoic, calculating, a man who had spent 6 years dismantling French power in Spain, victory by bloody victory. He did not love war. He did not romanticize it. He called it a necessary evil and fought it like a surgeon, precise, cold, methodical. He commanded 68,000 men, British, Dutch, Belgian, German, a patchwork army cobbled together in weeks, unified only by fear of Napoleon's return. Many of them had never fought together. Some had never fought at all. Wellington did not speak much that morning. He rode his horse Copenhagen along the ridge, inspecting positions, nodding to officers, offering no grand speeches. His orders were simple: hold the line. That was all. Because Wellington knew something Napoleon often forgot, that war is not won by brilliance alone. It is won by endurance. By soldiers who refuse to break even when the world is breaking around them. Between the two ridges lay a valley, narrow, muddy, flanked by farmhouses and hedges and fields, of rye that swayed in the wind like an audience waiting for a performance. The village of Waterloo sat to the north. The crossroads of Quatre Bras lay to the south. And in the center, between two armies that hated each other with the weight of 20 years of war, was a farmhouse, Hougoumont, a stone fortress surrounded by gardens, orchards, and high walls. It would become the grave of thousands. Napoleon had escaped from Elba 3 months earlier, the island prison where Europe's kings had exiled him, thinking the war was over, thinking he was finished. They were wrong. He landed in France with 1,000 men and no plan except audacity. Within 20 days, he had retaken Paris without firing a shot. The soldiers sent to arrest him had joined him instead. King Louis XVI fled in the night, and Napoleon, once again, sat on the throne. Europe panicked. The Seventh Coalition formed overnight. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia. They pledged 700,000 soldiers to destroy him. Not defeat, destroy. This time there would be no exile, no mercy, no second chances. Napoleon knew this. He knew he could not win a long war, so he chose speed. He would strike before the coalition armies could unite, divide them, destroy them one by one. It was his only chance. He marched north into Belgium with 128,000 men. On June 16th, he split his army. He sent Marshal Ney to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras. He personally attacked the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher at Ligny. The battle was brutal. The Prussians broke. Blücher himself was trampled by cavalry, buried under his dying horse, and left for dead in the mud. But his officers pulled him out, cleaned him, bandaged him, and he ordered his army to retreat north, not east, where Napoleon expected, but north, toward Wellington. Napoleon did not know this. He thought the Prussians were fleeing. He thought they were finished. So on the morning of June 18th, as rain hammered the fields of Waterloo, he prepared to crush Wellington alone. Just one more battle, one more victory, and then Paris, and then, who knew, maybe Rome, maybe Vienna, maybe the world again. His marshals were not so sure. Marshal Ney, and the bravest of the brave, was exhausted. He had lost thousands at Quatre Bras. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands shook. He still obeyed. Marshal Soult, Napoleon's chief of staff, urged caution. The ground is too wet. The cavalry will struggle. Wait for it to dry. Napoleon waved him off. I have studied Wellington, he said. He is a defensive general, cautious, predictable. We will break him before noon. But someone else spoke up. Marshal Grouchy, 30,000 men under his command, sent to chase the Prussians. He was miles away and too far to help. His orders were vague. His instincts told him to march toward the sound of guns. But his orders said, pursue the Prussians, so he did. And in doing so, he sealed Napoleon's fate. Wellington did not sleep that night. He spent it riding between units, checking defenses, positioning artillery. His army was tired. His Allied troops were nervous. His British regulars were steady but outnumbered. He had 68,000 men to Napoleon's 72,000. He had fewer cavalry, fewer guns, and no guarantee that the Prussians would arrive in time, but he had terrain. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean was shallow but commanding. It allowed his infantry to lie down behind the crest, invisible to French artillery. The farmhouses, Hougomont to the west, La Haye-Sainte in the center, Papelotte to the east, could be turned into fortresses, choke points, anchors. Wellington placed 1,500 men inside Hougomont. Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, German riflemen. He told them hold it. At all costs, he knew Napoleon would attack there first. Not because it mattered strategically, it was off to the side, away from the main line, but because Napoleon could not help himself. He saw obstacles and wanted them gone. Wellington was counting on that. At La Haye-Sainte, he placed the King's German Legion, 400 riflemen, good soldiers, loyal, disciplined. He gave them sandbags, ammunition, and orders to hold the road. Do not retreat unless I order it. They nodded. Behind the ridge, he hid his main infantry. 20,000 redcoats and Allied troops lying flat in the mud, invisible, waiting. His artillery, 60 guns, was positioned on the forward slope, exposed, vulnerable, but necessary. Wellington stood on the ridge as dawn broke, watching the French camp come alive across the valley. Campfires flickered. Drums began to beat. Men stood and stretched and loaded muskets and waited for the order that would send them into hell. A junior officer rode up beside him. Sir, do you think they'll come? Wellington didn't look at him. They'll come. The officer hesitated. And do you think we'll hold? Wellington raised his telescope, scanned the French lines, counted guns, counted columns, counted flags, then he lowered the glass. If the Prussians arrive, we'll hold. And if they don't? Wellington turned his horse. Then we'll hold anyway. At 11:30 a.m., the guns opened fire. Not French guns, British guns. A single cannon shot, a signal, a warning. A declaration, we are ready. Come and take us, Napoleon smiled. He turned to his officers. Gentlemen, today we will write history. Marshal Ney mounted his horse. The Grande Armée began to move, and in the valley between two ridges, the mud waited to drink. War is not chaos. It looks like chaos. Sounds like it. Smells like it. But beneath the smoke and screaming, beneath the blood and broken bones, war is a chess game played with human pieces. Every commander knows this. The question is who moves first. Napoleon moved first. He always did. At 11:30 a.m. he gave the order. 80 French guns opened fire on Wellington's ridge. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical force. A concussive wave that rolled across the valley and slammed into earth and stone and flesh. Cannonballs tore through the air, whistling, screaming, crashing into the ridge with the weight of God's fist. But Wellington's men were not there. They were behind the ridge, lying flat, invisible. The cannonballs hit empty ground, mud, grass, nothing. Napoleon watched through his telescope, frowning. He expected panic, retreat, confusion. Instead, silence. He did not understand. How could an army absorb that much fire and not break? The answer was simple. Wellington had studied him. Wellington knew Napoleon's tactics. He knew Napoleon loved the Grand Battery, massing artillery to shatter enemy morale before the infantry even moved. He knew Napoleon believed in spectacle, in overwhelming force, in breaking the enemy's will before breaking their line. So Wellington hid his men, not all of them. His artillery stayed forward, exposed, trading shots with the French guns. His gunners worked in hell, loading, firing, ducking as French cannonballs screamed overhead. Men were torn apart, limbs flew, blood pooled in the mud, but they held because they had orders and because they were British. Napoleon's plan was elegant. First, artillery, soften the center. Second, infantry assault on Hougomont, draw Wellington's reserves west. Third, massive infantry attack on the center, break the ridge. Fourth, cavalry exploitation, pursue, destroy. Fifth, victory by nightfall. It was a good plan. It had worked at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Wagram, but Waterloo was not Austerlitz. The ground was wrong. The mud was too deep. The rain had turned the valley into a swamp. Cavalry would struggle. Artillery would sink. Infantry would march slowly, exposed, vulnerable. And the enemy was different. Wellington was not an Austrian general clinging to outdated tactics. He was not a Prussian, rigid and predictable. He was British, and the British had spent 6 years in Spain learning how to kill Frenchmen efficiently. They were very good at it. At noon, Prince Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother, led 6,000 men toward Hougomont. Jérôme was 30 years old, brave, reckless, desperate to prove himself. He had been given a simple task: demonstrate against Hougomont. Threaten it. Pin down the defenders. Nothing more. But Jérôme wanted glory, so he attacked. His columns marched through the orchard south of the farmhouse, muskets ready, drums beating the pas de charge, the rhythm of assault. They expected light resistance, a few riflemen, maybe a company of guards. They got hell from the walls of Hougomont, from the windows, from the hedges and gardens and gates. British and German soldiers opened fire, volleys, musket fire so dense it sounded like tearing cloth. Men fell in rows. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear. The orchard filled with smoke. Jérôme's men pushed forward. They reached the south gate. They tried to break it down with axes, muskets, shoulders. The defenders poured boiling water from the windows, fired point blank through cracks in the wood, through stones. The gate held. Jerome sent more men and more and more. By 12:30 p.m., he had committed 9,000 soldiers to capturing a farmhouse that did not matter. Wellington watched from the ridge. He smiled. Inside Hougoumont, Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonald of the Coldstream Guard stood in the courtyard, sword drawn, covered in blood and ash. He was a giant of a man and 6 feet 4 inches, broad-shouldered, calm under fire. His men loved him, not because he was kind, but because he was there. In the smoke, in the fire, always. A soldier ran up to him. "Sir, the north gate! They've broken through." MacDonald did not run. He walked. He walked through the smoke, through the chaos, through the screaming, to the north gate, and found 30 French soldiers pouring into the courtyard, bayonets fixed, eyes wild. MacDonald did not shout orders. He grabbed the gate with his bare hands, and he pushed. Other guards joined him. Together they slammed the gate shut, trapping French soldiers inside. Then they killed them. All of them. Bayonets, swords, musket butts. The courtyard fell silent. MacDonald turned to his men. "Hold this gate." They did. For the next 6 hours. At 1 p.m., Napoleon unleashed the main assault. 17,000 infantry, 4 divisions, marching in columns toward Wellington's center. They moved slowly. The mud sucked at their boots. Every step was a fight, but they marched anyway, drums beating, eagles raised, voices roaring, "Vive l'Empereur." They believed in him. They always had. Marshal Ney led them forward, riding at the front, sword raised, hat gone, uniform torn. He had 5 horses shot from under him that day. He would walk the last attack on foot, covered in blood, still swinging his sword. The French columns climbed the slope toward the ridge. Wellington's infantry, hidden behind the crest, waited. Wellington himself stood near the center, watch in hand, expression unreadable. An officer beside him whispered, "Sir, they're coming." Wellington nodded. "Let them." The French columns reached the crest and then, "Stand up, present." 20,000 British soldiers rose from the mud like ghosts. The French froze. Fire. The world exploded. Musket volleys at 30 yards, point blank, devastating. The first French ranks disintegrated. Men fell in heaps. Officers vanished. Eagles tilted, fell, disappeared into smoke. The British reloaded. Fire. Again, fire. Again. The French columns staggered, wavered. Then, charge! British infantry surged forward, bayonets fixed, roaring. They crashed into the French like a wave into sand. The columns broke, turned, fled. Wellington watched them run. He did not smile this time. He knew this was just the beginning. War devours time. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours collapse into seconds. Men live entire lifetimes between heartbeats. Terror, courage, rage, despair, all compressed into the space between loading a musket and pulling the trigger. At 1:30 p.m., the battlefield was already unrecognizable. The valley was a graveyard. Thousands of bodies lay in the mud, French and British and Dutch tangled together in death like lovers. The wounded crawled toward the rear, leaving trails of blood. The dying called for water, for mothers, for God. No one answered. The air was thick with smoke, black powder, burning wood, the sweet, sick stench of torn flesh. Visibility was 20 yards at best. Commands were shouted, misheard, ignored. Soldiers fired at shadows. Officers led charges that never reached their targets. Regiments collided in the smoke, fought hand to hand, then vanished again into the gray. This was not strategy, this was butchery, and it had only just begun. Napoleon stood on his command post at La Belle Alliance, a farmhouse south of the battlefield, watching the French assault. "Falter?" He said nothing. His marshals exchanged glances. Soult leaned forward. "Sire, the columns are breaking. Perhaps we should..." "Wait." Napoleon's voice was flat, distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. He had been awake for 40 hours. His stomach burned with ulcers. His hemorrhoids made sitting agony. His mind, at once sharp enough to calculate artillery trajectories in his head, to memorize the names of 10,000 soldiers, to see battles 3 moves ahead, and was dulled by pain and exhaustion. But he was still Napoleon. He raised his telescope, scanned the ridge, counted flags, cannon positions, movement. Then he lowered the glass and turned to Marshal Ney. "They are weak in the center. Wellington has committed his reserves to Hougoumont. The ridge is vulnerable." Ney frowned. "Sire, the infantry needs support. The cavalry will crush them." Napoleon's eyes locked on Ney's. "Take the cavalry. All of it. Break Wellington's center. End this." Ney hesitated. He had commanded cavalry charges before. Hundreds of them. But this was different. The ground was mud. The enemy was dug in. The British squares were unbroken. Charging them was suicide, but this was Napoleon. And Ney was le brave des braves. He saluted. "Vive l'Empereur." Then he rode toward 5,000 horsemen. At 2 p.m., the earth began to shake. Wellington felt it first. A vibration in the soles of his boots, faint, rhythmic, growing. He raised his telescope and saw death coming. 5,000 French cavalry, cuirassiers in steel breastplates, lancers with pennants flying, dragoons and hussars and carabiniers, a wall of muscle and metal and rage, thundering across the valley at full gallop. Wellington lowered the telescope. Squares. The order rippled down the line. British infantry regiments shifted formation from lines into squares, hollow rectangles of men, 4 ranks deep, bayonets bristling outward like hedgehogs. The outer ranks knelt. The inner ranks stood, muskets ready. From above, the ridge looked like a chessboard of red-coated squares, scattered across the slope, waiting. Wellington rode between them, calm, voice steady. Hold your ground. Do not fire until they are upon you. Aim for the horses. The men nodded. They did not cheer, did not shout. They simply waited. The cavalry came closer, closer. The ground shook harder now. The thunder of hooves drowned out everything. The cuirassiers lowered their sabers. The lancers leveled their lances. They were 50 yards away. 30, 20, fire! The first volley ripped through the French cavalry like a scythe through wheat. Horses screamed, men tumbled, lances clattered, but the charge did not stop. The cavalry hit the squares and bounced off, because British infantry squares, when properly formed, were invincible to cavalry. The horses would not charge into the wall of bayonets. They swerved, reared, panicked. The riders hacked at the outer ranks, but the squares held firm, firing volleys into the mass of horseflesh and steel at point-blank range. The cavalry circled, charged again, again. Each time they were repulsed. Each time, more men died, but they kept coming, because Ney was with them, sword in hand, screaming orders, refusing to retreat. Inside one of the squares, the 28th Regiment of Foot, Private Thomas Fletcher crouched behind his musket, ears ringing, hands shaking. He was 19 years old. This was his first battle. A cuirassier rode past, saber slashing downward. Fletcher fired without aiming. The cuirassier fell. Fletcher reloaded, fingers fumbling, powder spilling. Around him men were screaming, praying, cursing. His sergeant grabbed his shoulder. "Fletcher! Steady, boy!" Fletcher nodded. Then a cannonball struck the square. It passed through 6 men. Fletcher watched them disintegrate, torsos, limbs, heads gone, just gone. The sergeant closed the gap. Hold the line. Fletcher reloaded. He did not think, did not feel. He just reloaded. At 3 p.m., the cavalry attacks continued. Ney was insane with rage. He had lost 3 horses. His uniform was shredded. Blood ran down his face from a dozen cuts. But he would not stop. He rallied the cavalry. Charged again. Was repulsed. Rallied. Charged. Wellington watched from the ridge. Expression grim. An aide rode up. "Sir, the squares are holding, but ammunition is running low. If they charge again, they will charge again." Wellington scanned the eastern horizon looking for Prussians. They were not there. At 3:30 p.m., Napoleon received a message. "Sire, Prussian forces spotted to the east. 30,000 men. Advancing." Napoleon's jaw tightened. Blücher, the old bastard, had not retreated. He had regrouped, and now he was here. Napoleon turned to his remaining reserves. The Imperial Guard, 15,000 veteran soldiers, the best in Europe, undefeated in 20 years of war. He had planned to hold them back, to use them for the final crushing blow. But now he had no choice. He sent half the guard east to hold off the Prussians. He kept the other half in reserve, just in case. At 4 p.m., Marshal Ney captured La Haye Sainte, the farmhouse in the center of Wellington's line. 400 German riflemen had held it for 5 hours, but they ran out of ammunition. Ney's infantry stormed the walls, killed the defenders, raised the French flag. For the first time that day, the French had a foothold on the ridge. Ney saw it, saw the British line exposed, saw the gap. He turned to his aides. "Where is the reserve? Give me infantry. 1 division, just 1, and I will break them." But there was no reserve. Napoleon had sent the guard east. Ney screamed, wept, begged. No one answered, so he charged again, alone, on foot, sword in hand. There is a moment in every battle when everything breaks. Not the lines, not the formations, not the guns, everything. Time stops making sense. Orders are lost in the smoke. Officers demit command. Regiments dissolve into mobs of desperate men fighting for survival. The plan, then whatever it was, becomes irrelevant. Only instinct remains. At 5 p.m., Waterloo reached that moment. The ridge was a slaughterhouse. Wellington's line was bending. Not breaking, not yet, but bending. British regiments that had started the day with 800 men were down to 300. Dutch and Belgian units were wavering. Allied troops, exhausted and terrified, began to drift toward the rear. Wellington rode between them, voice hoarse, shouting orders that half the men could not hear. "Hold! Just hold!" He did not promise reinforcements, did not promise victory. He promised nothing, because he had nothing left to promise. His artillery was smashed. Half his guns were silent, their crews dead or dying. His cavalry had been shattered in countercharges. His infantry was clinging to the ridge by sheer stubbornness. And still the French came, wave after wave. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, coordinated chaos. Napoleon's army was bleeding to death in the valley, but it would not stop. Could not stop, because if they stopped, they lost. And if they lost, Napoleon was finished. At La Haye Sainte, French infantry poured through the captured farmhouse, surging uphill toward Wellington's center. They were so close now, 30 yards from the British line, close enough to see faces. Close enough to hear commands. British infantry fired volleys at point-blank range. The French fired back. Men fell in heaps. The smoke was so thick that soldiers stumbled over corpses without realizing they were dead. A British colonel, Sir Colin Halkett, stood in the center of his regiment, sword raised, screaming orders. "Hold them! Hold!" A musket ball struck his jaw, shattered it. He collapsed, blood pouring from his mouth. His men caught him, dragged him to the rear, but the line held because British soldiers did not know how to retreat. To the east, the Prussians arrived, 30,000 men under Field Marshal Blücher, old battered, exhausted from a forced march through mud and rain. But here, Blücher himself was 73 years old. He had been trampled at Ligny 2 days earlier, crushed under his horse, left for dead. His ribs were cracked. His face was bruised black and blue. He could barely sit upright, but he had made a promise to Wellington. I will come. And so he came. At 4:30 p.m., Prussian artillery opened fire on Napoleon's right flank. At 5:00 p.m., Prussian infantry attacked the village of Plancenoit, a key position behind Napoleon's. Napoleon's reserves, half the Imperial Guard, rushed to meet them. The village became a meat grinder. House-to-house fighting, bayonets in alleys. Muskets fired through windows. French guardsmen and Prussian grenadiers killed each other in the streets, in the courtyards, in the cellars. The village changed hands 4 times in 2 hours. Napoleon rode toward the sound of the guns, face pale. Hold Plancenoit. At all costs, his officers saluted. But they knew the truth. The Prussians were not going to stop. At 6:00 p.m., Wellington's line was barely alive. His center had collapsed inward. Regiments that had held for 7 hours were down to 50 men. Officers were dead. Colors were captured. Units were fighting under sergeants, under corporals, under privates who refused to leave. Wellington himself was everywhere, riding from one crisis to the next, shoring up gaps, redirecting survivors, personally commanding battalions. An aide found him near the center, standing beside a shattered square. "Sir, we've lost half the line. The reserves are gone. If they attack again..." Wellington cut him off. "Has Blücher arrived?" "Yes, sir. The Prussians are engaging the French." "Right." Wellington nodded. "Then we hold." "But, sir..." "We hold." The aide saluted and rode off. Wellington turned back to the valley and saw Napoleon's final move. The Imperial Guard, 5 battalions, 3,000 men, veterans of Egypt, Italy, Spain, Russia, men who had never been defeated, never retreated, never broken. They formed in columns at the base of the ridge, tall bearskin hats, blue coats, white cross belts, silent, grim, ready. Napoleon himself rode before them. He did not give a speech. He did not need to. He simply raised his sword. The guard marched. Thump, thump, thump. Drums, slow, rhythmic. The sound of death approaching. They climbed the ridge in perfect formation, bayonets gleaming, colors flying. French infantry parted to let them through, cheering, weeping. The guard advances. The guard! Wellington watched them come. For the first time that day, his face showed emotion, fear, because if the guard broke his line, and if they reached the summit, it was over. He turned to his remaining regiments. Every man stands. If they break, we all die. No one moved, no one ran. They simply stood. The Imperial Guard reached the crest at 7:00 p.m. Wellington's infantry rose to meet them, 50 yards apart, 30, 20, fire, volleys, point blank, devastating. The first rank of the guard fell. The second rank stepped over them, fired. Back up, British soldiers fell. The lines collided. Bayonets, musket, butts, swords, teeth. Men screamed, men died, men killed. The guard pushed forward. The British line bent and held. The guard pushed again, harder. Vive l'Empereur. But Wellington's regiments did not break. They could not break because behind them was nothing. No reserves, no reinforcements, just mud and corpses and the promise that if they ran, they would die anyway. So they stood, and they fought, and slowly, impossibly, the Imperial Guard stopped advancing. At 7:15 p.m., a British officer, Sir Colin Halkett's successor, stood before the 52nd Regiment and gave an order that should not have worked. Wheel forward. Flank them. The 52nd, exhausted, bleeding, half dead, turned 90 degrees and marched into the flank of the Imperial Guard, fired a volley, then charged. The guard, shocked, surrounded, bleeding, wavered. For the first time in 20 years, they wavered. Wellington saw it. He stood in his stirrups, raised his hat, waved it forward. Now, charge! 20,000 British, Dutch, and German soldiers, and what was left of them, surged forward, screaming, bayonets leveled. The guard broke, turned, ran. Someone shouted, "La garde recule!" The guard retreats! The word spread like fire through the French army, and then collapse. An army does not die all at once. It dies in pieces. First, the men at the edges, the ones who can see the rear, who can calculate distance, who can run. They break, drop their muskets, flee. Then the center. Officers shout orders no one follows. Sergeants try to hold lines that no longer exist. Standards fall. Eagles vanish into the mud. Finally, the corps, the veterans, the believers. They fight until they cannot fight anymore, until their ammunition is gone, until their bayonets break, until they are alone, surrounded, dying. At 7:30 p.m., the French army died. The Imperial Guard's retreat triggered a collapse. Units that had fought all day, infantry, cavalry, artillery, suddenly realized they were surrounded. Prussians to the east, British to the north. No reserves. No hope. They ran, thousands of them, streaming south down the Brussels road, throwing away weapons, tearing off uniforms, abandoning abandoning wounded comrades. Officers tried to rally them. Some were shot by their own men. Others joined the rout. Marshal Ney was left behind. He stood in the middle of the road, sword broken, uniform in tatters, covered head to toe in blood and mud. He had no horse, no regiment, no orders. He simply stood there, swinging his broken sword at nothing, screaming, "Come see how a Marshal of France dies." No one came. He stumbled south alone into the darkness. Wellington did not pursue immediately. He could not. His army was shattered. Half his regiments had ceased to exist. The survivors were too exhausted to march. Some collapsed where they stood. Others sat in the mud, staring at nothing, too numb to feel victory. Wellington rode across the ridge, watching the French flee, and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just emptiness. He dismounted near La Haye Sainte, where the wounded lay in rows, moaning, crying, calling for water. Surgeons worked by lantern light, amputating limbs, stitching wounds, covering faces. An aide approached. "Sir, we've won." Wellington looked at him. "Won?" He gestured toward the field. "Look at it." The valley was a carpet of bodies. 10,000 French, 5,000 British, 3,000 Allied, 18,000 men dead or dying in a space smaller than a village square. Wellington turned away. "I hope to God I've fought my last battle." Napoleon fled. At 8 p.m., as the French army dissolved around him, his aides begged him to leave. "Sire, the Prussians are pursuing. If they catch you..." Napoleon said nothing. He climbed into his carriage, closed the curtain and rode south. Behind him, the Imperial Guard made a final stand. 2 battalions formed squares around the Brussels road, holding off Prussian cavalry to buy time for Napoleon's escape. Blücher himself arrived, sword drawn, shouting, "No prisoners! No mercy!" The Prussians circled the squares, fired artillery at point-blank range. The guard did not break, did not surrender. They died where they stood. By 10 p.m. it was over. The battlefield fell silent. The guns stopped. The screaming faded. Only the wind remained, carrying the smell of death across the fields. Wellington and Blücher met near La Belle Alliance, Napoleon's former headquarters. At midnight, they did not embrace. They did not cheer. Blücher, 73 years old, his face a mask of bruises, dismounted stiffly and extended his hand. Wellington took it. Their grip was firm. "Brief, mein lieber Kamerad," Blücher said in broken French. "Quelle affaire?" "My dear comrade." "What a business." Wellington nodded. Indeed, that was all. They stood in silence. 2 old men surrounded by the wreckage of empires, and looked out over a field that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blücher broke the silence first. "We will call it the Battle of La Belle Alliance." "Yes?" Wellington shook his head. "No, we will call it Waterloo," the name of the village where he had slept the night before, where he had written his dispatch, where he would return to count the cost. Blücher shrugged. "As you wish." Then he remounted his horse. "My men will pursue Napoleon. You rest. You have earned it." Wellington watched him ride into the darkness, leading Prussian cavalry south, hunting the fleeing French, giving no quarter. The pursuit would continue for days. Thousands of French soldiers would be cut down on the roads. Wounded men would be bayoneted in ditches. Prisoners would be shot. War does not end cleanly. It bleeds. Inside Hougoumont, the fires still burned. The farmhouse, that fought over for 12 hours, defended by 1,500 men against 9,000, was a ruin. The walls were pockmarked with musket balls. The courtyard was piled with bodies. The chapel somehow still stood. Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonell walked through the wreckage, stepping over the dead, checking for survivors. He found a French drummer boy, no older than 14, hiding in the garden. The boy's uniform was too large. His drum was shattered. He looked up at MacDonell with wide, terrified eyes. MacDonell knelt. "It's over," he said in French. "You're safe now." The boy burst into tears. MacDonell carried him out. At 2 a.m., Wellington returned to his headquarters in the village of Waterloo, a small inn on the Brussels road. His staff waited for him, silent, exhausted. Wellington dismounted slowly. His back ached. His throat was raw from shouting. His eyes burned from smoke. He walked inside without a word. In the room upstairs, he sat at a desk and began writing his dispatch to London. The official report, the list of dead and wounded, the summary of the battle. His hand shook as he wrote names, so many names, officers he had known for years, friends, colleagues, men who had dined with him the night before and were now corpses in a Belgian field. He paused, set down the pen, covered his face with his hands. His aide, standing in the doorway, started to speak. "Sir," Wellington raised a hand. "Leave me." The aide obeyed. Wellington sat alone in the candlelight, surrounded by silence, and wept, not for victory, for the price of it. The dead do not bury themselves. For 3 days after the battle, work parties moved across the field, collecting bodies. French, British, Prussian, Dutch, German. They were piled into mass graves, trenches 30 feet long, 6 feet deep, filled with corpses stacked like firewood. The wounded were loaded onto carts and taken to Brussels, where every church, every hospital, every inn became a surgery. The streets ran red. The air stank of gangrene. Surgeons worked without rest, amputating limbs by the hundred, knowing most of the men would die anyway. Local villagers walked the battlefield. Scavenging. They took uniforms, boots, weapons, teeth. Yes, teeth. Dentists paid well for teeth pulled from the dead. Waterloo teeth, they were called. They would be made into dentures for the wealthy in London and Paris. The wounded, who could not be moved, lay in the fields for days. Some were found alive, half buried in mud, delirious with fever. Others were found dead, clutching letters they would never send. One British soldier, discovered 3 days after the battle, had written a note in the dirt beside him. "Tell my mother I did my duty." He died before anyone could ask his name. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st. He tried to rally support, tried to raise another army, tried to convince the government that one defeat did not mean the end. They did not believe him. On June 22nd, he abdicated for the second time. On June 24th, he fled Paris, hoping to escape to America. He never made it. On July 15th, he surrendered to the British Royal Navy, hoping for asylum in England. They sent him to St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic, 4,000 miles from Europe, a volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. No escape, no visitors, no hope. He would live there for 6 years. He spent his days dictating memoirs, rewriting history, blaming everyone but himself for Waterloo. He claimed the rain delayed him, that Ney disobeyed orders, that Grouchy failed to arrive, that the Prussians arrived too soon. He never admitted the truth, that he was beaten by a better defensive general, that Wellington had read him perfectly, that the British infantry, despised by Napoleon as mere mercenaries, had stood their ground and refused to break. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died, stomach cancer, the doctors said, though some whispered poison. His last words in delirium: France, army, head of the army, the man who had reshaped Europe, who had commanded millions, who had crowned himself emperor, died alone in a bed on a forgotten island, calling for an army that no longer existed. Wellington lived another 37 years. He became Prime Minister of Britain, a politician, a statesman, a legend. But he hated it. He hated the questions, the ceremonies, the celebrations, the paintings of Waterloo that made it look glorious, the poems that made it sound heroic. When asked about the battle, he would say, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." He refused to attend Waterloo anniversaries, refused to give speeches, refused to glorify what had happened. Once, late in life, a young officer asked him, "Sir, what was the secret to your victory?" Wellington looked at him. "I was there. That was all." On September 14, 1852, the Duke of Wellington died at the age of 83. His funeral was a national event. 2 million people lined the streets of London. His coffin, made from melted French cannons, was pulled by 12 horses draped in black. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, next to Admiral Nelson. 2 men who had saved Britain. 2 men who had never wanted to. Waterloo changed Europe forever. It ended Napoleon's dream of a united continent under French rule. It restored the old monarchies. The kings and emperors who had fled in terror now returned to their thrones, pretending they had never left. It began the Congress system, an alliance of great powers meant to prevent another Napoleon. It worked for a while. There would be no continent-wide war in Europe for 99 years, until 1914, but the deeper change was invisible. Waterloo marked the end of an era, the end of the idea that one man, through brilliance, charisma, and will, could reshape the world. Napoleon had tried, and he had failed, not because he lacked genius, not because his soldiers lacked courage, but because, in the end, war is not won by brilliance, it is won by endurance, by soldiers who stand when every instinct screams to run, by commanders who refuse to gamble when the stakes are survival, by nations who understand that glory is a lie and that victory is just not losing. Wellington understood that. Napoleon never did. Today, the battlefield at Waterloo is a monument. A massive earthen mound, the Lion's Mound, rises 140 feet above the field. Built by the Dutch to commemorate the Prince of Orange's wound, it required so much earth that it reshaped the terrain, erasing the ridge Wellington had defended. He hated it. "They have ruined my battlefield," he said. Tourists walk the ground now. They take photos, buy souvenirs, listen to guides explain tactics and strategy. Few of them pause at the mass graves. Few of them imagine what it sounded like, the screaming, the thunder, the silence after. Few of them understand that 48,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day, in a space you could walk across in 20 minutes. The field looks peaceful now. Green grass, quiet farms, birds singing, but the ground remembers. If you dig anywhere on that field even today, you will find bones, musket balls, buttons, teeth. The soil is stained black with blood that will never wash away. Was Waterloo worth it? Was any of it worth it? The 23 years of war, the 6 million dead, the cities burned, the empire shattered, the widows, the orphans, the soldiers who came home missing limbs, missing minds, missing themselves. Wellington said once, "I have seen enough of war to know that there is no such thing as a good war or a bad peace." But he fought anyway, because sometimes there is no choice. Sometimes the only options are stand or watch the world burn. Wellington stood, so did his soldiers, and in the mud of Waterloo, against an army that had conquered Europe, they held the line, not because they were heroes, but because they refused to be anything else. Epilogue. There is a letter in the British National Archives, written by a British sergeant to his wife the night before. "Waterloo, my dearest Mary, Tomorrow we fight. I do not know if I will live, but know this, and if I fall, it will not be in vain. I fight not for glory, not for king, but so that you and our children may sleep in peace. That is enough. Your loving husband, Thomas. Thomas survived. He lived to see his children grow, to see peace return to Europe, to see the world move on and forget the names of the men who saved it. He never spoke of Waterloo. When his grandson asked him years later, "Grandfather, were you a hero?" Thomas shook his head. "No, boy. I was just there." History remembers the generals, but the ground remembers everyone. Final question. If you had been in Wellington's place that morning, outnumbered, outgunned, with no guarantee of reinforcement, would you have stood and fought, or would you have withdrawn, preserved your army, and let Napoleon have his victory? In war, is holding the line always the right choice, or is survival sometimes the greater courage?